recording.
Very good.
Welcome. This is Fair Trends Podcast. Today, my guest is Alex Devereux, the founder of the Devereux Group. And my question is, do you know and realize that you make 35,000 decisions a day? And what if you had a way to get trained to be able to manage those, to navigate them a little bit better, to get better outcomes? And I think that's one of the things that fascinates my guest. And we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about when I first met Alex, my impression was that he was a turnaround specialist, and I was just so amazed with the kind of work that you do. And I want to go into that and hear a little bit about the work that you do there. But today we're also going to talk about your latest book, Leading and Thriving, Progressive Leadership Guide to Performance and DEI Growth, which was a little bit of an eye-opener for me, but it kind of falls within the realm of getting better outcomes in organizations. And I also want to emphasize that what you teach and how you coach, granted, you've got a background in General Dynamics and British Petroleum and working with major corporations, but a lot of these things also apply to a lot of the people I talk to who are entrepreneurs.
Right.
So with that, welcome. I'm thrilled that you made the time to do this today. And so maybe we could just kind of get into this a little bit, and you could start off by telling us a little bit about your business and how you help clients get better outcomes. I want to refer people to, in the show notes, we'll send people to your site so they can see that there's several great case studies that take people through how you've helped their businesses grow by finding new revenue streams, by increasing efficiencies. Basically, what I felt when I met you was you come in and you turn people around, but the way that you do it is what's special. So take it away and tell us a little about the business, and maybe give us one of your case study stories to give people an idea.
Wow. Well, thank you, Jan. First of all, I really do appreciate the opportunity to share my background with you and your audience, and most importantly, share some my unique perspective. I consider it unique. Everybody's unique, right? So from my perspective and how I look at things and how I evolve, my evolution was kind of interesting. I started in architecture in high school and went from architecture thinking I was going to become an architect, like Frank Lloyd Wright was my idol, right? And then I decided I need to learn about structures, and I became a structural engineer. And then I decided that, well, this is great, but maybe there's more. And so I got this call from this company and said, hey, why don't you come to Texas and work for us? I said, well, let me see what you guys have to offer. And it turns out it was the F-16 program with General Dynamics. And so I said, well, buildings don't move like that. So I decided to work on the F-16 program versus working on a static high-rise structure. And so that exposed me to a lot of interesting things with materials. And I had to reorient my mind, my perspective in terms of the business and what my intentions were, because I had to learn, aspects of aerospace, and I had to learn about other things that I didn't have to worry about in a building. And so it was a fantastic learning experience for me. And then I said, okay, so enough of working on, these I've contributed to the country. I did my civic duty in terms of supporting the country with these ships. And then I said, and I got a call from BP, and they said, hey, we're still interested in you. We'd like for you to design these high temperature systems for us for the petrochemical, steel, and ceramic industry. So I ended up being exposed to the more high-tech products. It was basically a luminous silica-based product. It was lightweight material combined with the space shuttle. So I went through that experience working on both domestic and international projects. And so during that transition, I ended up becoming, a sales engineer, where I had clients like Mobile Research and Exxon, and of course OEMs like Foster Wheeler. So I was working with those companies and made that transition. But I also had projects that I worked on both domestically and overseas. And so my wife said to me, she said, here's this young man, he's struggling with his business of tool and die shop. And I said, so what do I know about tool and die shops? I said, I know something about mechanical stuff, but I know it's about business. And so she said, you'll figure it out. So the theme for me has been, you'll figure it out. So I went there, I observed him training someone. I noticed the person wasn't very happy. After the training, I said, I noticed this person wasn't happy. I said, is there any particular reason why? He said, well, you know, they come and they work for me about a month and then they leave. And I said, well, where do they go? He said, well, they go work for my competitor. I said, well, let me ask you this question. Are you in the business of producing products, or are you in the business of training? Somebody doesn't produce products. I said, right now you're in the training business. You need to figure out how to get paid by your competitors. And if not, then you need to figure out how to keep people and of course, you know, figure out how to grow your business. And so that's where we started. We started looking at him and training him on how to train better to retain people.
Okay.
And so then I brought in a part-time bookkeeper and say, she can take care of your books. You don't have a lot of business. And I said, and then I said also, so how were you dressed how do you dress when you go out and talk to your clients? And he said to me, oh, well, I talk the way I'm in the shop. And I said, wrong. So he had long hair. I said, you need to comb your hair, if not cut it or trim it. I said, you need to trim your beard. I said, you need to put on a clean shirt, you know, with the t-shirt on, because we're in Western New York. So it's
you
humid.
need to make a good impression.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I said, so that we need to do that. So we did that, and we turned them around in 90 days.
Wow.
And I said, wow. I said, I kind of like this, you know, I like
kind of good at it.
Right. Yeah. Well, not so much good, but it was, I figured something out. That's the whole point, is that I figured something out. I figured out how important it was for him to have an appearance that reflected his role. And so I did that and continued with him, and he grew the business, and he was able to adapt. And I said, well, all of a sudden, you know, as my career started to shift, I said, I think I'm more interested in helping people turn their business around, as opposed to just simply, you know, observing them struggle with their businesses, right, on the sidelines. And so I started making a transition into working for myself. And then, of course, that led me to with clients, you know, work with clients like family offices, or I'm sorry, family-owned businesses. And then, of course, even with executives and corporations, et cetera. So I was able to bring all those skills together. But what triggered my interest even more so was that it was during a time period when we had a lot of mergers and acquisitions and leveraged buyouts. And I said, look, you know, our industries were changing. You know, we were downsizing our smokestack industry. We were starting to get more into microcomputers, et cetera. And so we had this whole changing landscape. And I said, but what I saw the collateral damage was it's people. There were like thousands of people who were basically being damaged because of all these different buyouts and shutdowns. You know, it would shut down the plant, sell the equipment, ship the equipment over. And I said, so at least I'll try to help. So that's when I started focusing on the human side of mergers and acquisitions. So a lot of what I do moving forward, and what I did moving forward, was two things, especially with business owners. One, looking at how prepared they were to be successful in business. And this was before community colleges had small business training centers, et cetera. I was creating my own little training center. I had my own package of programs that I would use for sales, for organizational goal setting, et cetera. I was bringing all those tools into my clients and coaching them, especially the business owners. So I was working with business owners. Made that transition, worked in a lot of projects, et cetera. And then, of course, I got asked, I said, well, look, you know, I've been traveling a lot. I need to contribute to the community. By that time, I had relocated to Phoenix from the East Coast. And I said, I really need to support the community. And so I had this chance to tutor at this small college, math. I said, well, this is a way for me to get back to my technical skills, right? So I started tutoring this math class. Supervisor for the program at this college came to me and said he was responsible for the School of Drafting and Design. He said, hey, we need an instructor. We just lost an instructor mid-quarter. I said, okay, can you help us out? Boom. I said, well, I'll try. And I'm thinking it's like 2 days a week, 2 hours a day. As it turns out, it was 5 days a week, 4 hours a day. That's a career change, right? Yeah. So I had to make a decision as to whether or not I should move forward. And so, of course, my wife, she encouraged me to continue with education. And so there I was, teaching and tutoring math and teaching this engineering systems class. Several years later, all of a sudden now they're saying, we want you to become chair of the School of Drafting and Design. So there I was, the chair of this program. I had one program teaching civil architecture and mechanical associate program. Then they asked me, oh, by the way, we want you to now start a bachelor's game design program. Now we want you to start an associate visual communications program. And then now we want to start a construction management, a bachelor's in construction management program.
Wow.
And I was going, well, with all of these programs, you have to prepare. You have to, you have to do the things you need to do to be accredited, maintaining your accreditation. So I had to continue more education and learning. So the reason I tell that story, and then of course at tenured, I also became chair of the School of Business as well. And so that's another story. And I started a bachelor's project management program. But I tell the story is because as I moved into, I was still working with clients. And so as I started to make that transition, and finally when I was ready to make my transition out of education, I had this interesting package where I look at the entire process associated with revenue generation. On the front end, I look at maximizing revenue with sales and marketing. I also look at optimization as it relates to organizational activities. And then I look at the back end with return on investment, return on equity, and also including supply chain related issues. And then, of course, looking at the management team in terms of aligning them, because I found that one of the big challenges was that the management team wasn't where it needed to be. In terms of, with technology evolving, with a lot of technical companies, the managers didn't have a chance to really develop the people skills, they developed the technical skills, and that's how they were able to get promoted into these management roles.
And not just management, but also all the other people that are in the organization. Because
absolutely,
the thing I learned in reading your latest book was how you'd moved into diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how you identified that not only increases productivity, but can increase revenues. And that really sparked, I was really interested in that, but I'm fascinated to learn how your curiosity has taken you in your career, because you've been evolving as new things come at you. And so one of the things maybe you can talk about is when you first look at a client, when you're first approached with a problem, how do you take them through? What's the first thing that you look for?
Well, that's a very good question. And of course, the reason I tell my story, beginning of my career and then of course in education, is because that's what I do. I'm once an educator, always an educator. It's the type of educator you are. Are you sage on stage, or you want to roll your sleeves up and get in? And so what I started doing with my students is I was looking at ways to optimize my students in their learning, because I had adults coming back to school. So when I first started, with working with small businesses, it was them going back to school. I was training them to become better at their role in their tasks, right, with respect to their business. And so now here I am in this education mode where, I become more proficient, and where I can now look at them and not only look at them from the standpoint of just simply having a business and trying to figure out how to make money, but also how important it is to take that human aspect under consideration. Their ability to process information quickly, their ability to make effective decisions, their ability to address the things that are important to address. When we talk about, 35,000, decisions that we make, or thoughts we have, which also are related to decisions we make in a given day.
That's mind-boggling.
Yes, but you have to understand how to break it down into this micro clusters. You have a cluster of decisions you're making with respect to a particular category, and so the challenge is being able to organize your thoughts in such a way that you could actually generate momentum. Okay. And so when I, like, for example, in my book, I actually talk about, the first book I wrote was on decision making. And that was the reason I wrote it on decision making, because I saw it was inspired during the pandemic, when I saw all of these executives who were basically putting their resumes out on LinkedIn, or you saw that this VP of sales, for example, was leaving his company. And it's like, well, it takes 6 months to really gain traction, for a job, unless you already have something lined up. So I say, why are the key decision makers and the key influencers of the turnaround leaving? Those are the guys you want to have in place, right? So then when I started asking that question, I said, well, maybe it's because they're not prepared for what we consider the new norm. And the
Oh,
new
wow.
norm, as I saw it, was a paradigm shift.
It
So
is.
how do you prepare yourself for a paradigm shift? So I
Mhm.
said, well, it's related to decision making. So I started with saying, okay, you're making unconscious, you have this relationship of unconscious incompetence instead of not really knowing what's going on. And then you become competent. You become consciously competent, constantly incompetent, meaning that you know there's something going on. You're not quite sure what it is yet. And then you make a shift into conscious competency. When you make that transition, that's important. And then unconscious competence is what happens when you become very acclimated and you just kind of like move forward. And
Right.
that's what we often do, good or bad with those 35,000 decisions. They're either conscious or, they go through the entire spectrum. But when you're making a paradigm shift, and what most people don't understand paradigm shift is that you actually shift your mindset. You shift from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset, but it's important for you not to waver with respect to your growth mindset for it to bear fruit.
Right. Don't
And that's
fall
what
back on the fixed mindset, but keep this alive rather than falling back on bad habits, right?
it's like, for example, there's a degree of confidence you need to have with respect to the unknown is what we're really talking about.
Hmm.
A paradigmatic shift is one where there's no path defined for you.
Right. Right.
The
I
path
mean, the pandemic is a perfect example of
yes,
the upheaval of things that we knew or comfort levels or whatever
yes,
into quiet quitting and
yes,
yeah,
or rage quitting for that matter,
the
right?
great resignation. Yeah.
Right, yes. So what happens is this: how we manage to transition from conscious incompetence to conscious competence is
Right.
very important. And you have to commit one way or the other, because guess what? Most of your time is spent in sort of like this fixed mindset, which is conscious incompetence to some degree. If you don't continue to grow and improve your knowledge and your base in terms of yourself and about the things around you, then you really are still residing in that conscious incompetence, if not unconscious incompetence.
Right. So you can be losing people because you're stuck in this
Yes,
mode of this world you've created for yourself that's like everything should stay the same when
right.
everything around you is changing. So all of a sudden your world has stopped and the people around you are like, I got to move on. This
Absolutely,
isn't.
absolutely. And
So you lose your best people because they see that first and they're
yes,
out of here.
yes. Well, what happens is this with managers, and this is one of the things that I've started focusing on in the third book, which is the Leading and Thriving book,
Uh-huh.
is that I focused on the hurt.
Right.
Managers have to accept that responsibility. It's back to my in the beginning, and the lessons learned from when I first started with my first client, right? I was like, I don't know what I'm doing here, but I need to help him because he needs some help, and I have to figure this out. Is what is my first approach. So you
Right.
ask me, what's your first approach to a client? First approach is, let me just listen to them and find out what's going on,
Ah,
because if I prescribe something to them that's not there, it doesn't benefit them.
right.
So I try to focus on what's important for them based on where they are and based on where they're at, and of course what they need moving forward.
So
Because
you
what happens
listen.
is that, pardon me?
So you listen at first.
Yes, I listen first, I collect data, and that's why I talk about the education part, because one of the things I had to do with my students, because we're primarily adult educators, or not educators, but students. So those students basically average age 26. I had a gentleman who was 80 years old in the class,
Wow.
trying to learn technology. So now I'm having to deal with brain. How does the brain work? You've got a creative person, and then you have this person that's very empirical. And so now they have to learn both creative and empirical. So
Mhm.
you combine both. When I started all the different programs, I had those who were creative and artistic, and then I had those who had to learn math, and they had to learn physics.
Oh my
Yeah,
gosh.
right. So they had to learn the math, they had to learn the physics, but then they also had to be creative at the same time, do 3D modeling, learning technology, computer technology, programs, etc. So now they're going, both sides of their brains is happening at the same time. And then of course you have someone that maybe is not quite is not as computer literate, that's maybe pushing 50.
Uh-huh.
How do you help them? How do you help them when they haven't spent much time on the computer?
Yeah,
Right?
yeah. But they
Right?
need the help too.
Yeah. So, but what I also discovered was that it's just time. You need to take a little time. It doesn't mean you'll never learn it. It
Oh,
just
right.
means you just need to have a little more time
Mm-hmm.
to get acclimated to using a tool that you didn't learn to use at an early age.
Right,
That's
right.
all.
So this kind of speaks to the stages of the corporate life cycle where you look at that and how that impacts decision making, because a startup might be started by younger people, right? And as the
Right.
company goes through its stages of maturity, then you've got the 50-year-old who isn't as tech savvy as his 20-year-old employees. And how do you fix that gap and bring the 50 plus something manager an understanding of how things like diversity can improve not only his productivity, but his bottom line?
You're absolutely correct. The reason I created that model was because I said you can't have one side and not consider the other aspects of it.
Uh-huh.
We still live in a whole society, despite the fact that we want to do segmentation. I only want to focus on this one particular area, and I
Right.
don't want to focus on this other area. And I say, look, you know what? Part of the problem is that managers have not been taught how to be effective people managers. They've been taught how to manage process. So now when they're managing a process, they're basically looking at this one in a very narrow way. And
Uh-huh.
then anyone is when it's in that scope is the range of world that they're the ones who they really focus on or they direct their attention to when you have this entire spectrum to consider
I
and
can
all the differences
see
associated.
this is why people really need you, because you can step back and they think they've got this problem, like you say, it's narrow,
Right, right,
but you're looking at it as an outsider with experience in a multitude of businesses of different
right,
sizes and different industries,
right,
being able to look at it and go, no, you have
right.
more things to
Absolutely.
address than
Right.
this one thing. And so you can take them through the training to understand how to identify the problem, the scientific method, basically, that we all learned in ninth grade science. You kind of bring it back to this and go, okay, let's take a look at these problems together and let me walk you through what more you can do to kind of solve all these problems. What I'm really impressed with the case studies that you provide are some of these
Mhm.
examples where you turn companies around multiples, 300%, 1,000% by looking at their businesses. And maybe you can give one of those case studies
Sure.
before, and
Sure.
we'll refer people to where they can go find
Sure.
your book.
Sure. Well, this is great. An ideal opportunity to even share that with you right now.
Yeah.
So here's the thing. I look at the entire revenue generating process, right? But I do that, but look at people first. Then I look at the process. And then I look at performance, combined performance with process.
Uh-huh.
And so when this particular client was basically a VP of client services, a large, multinational company, they were headquartered in France, but they had New York, North America office.
Okay.
And so his client came to me and said, Alex, I have a problem. I said, what's the problem? He said, they want my client services team to generate revenue. So they were basically focused on the retail market and, of course, brick and mortar companies, like big companies, like tier one companies like Macy's, Neiman and Marcus, Dillard's,
Major department store
major
chains.
department stores, et cetera, right? So basically in this mix here, and he said they want my account strategy team to generate revenue. And I said, that's are you starting to search, do a job search? So you're going to be responsible for revenue with people who are focused on client services. and not really focused on
customer service is what you do.
right.
Yeah.
They're not focused on customer service. I mean, they're doing it for customer service, but they're not focused on generating revenue. It's a different mindset.
Right.
He said, yeah. I said, so are you putting your resume out? You know, you start talking. No. I said, I understand. I was just kidding. I said, but I said, so let's take a look at it. Let me take a look at it. So I took a look at it, thought about some things, and I came back to him because I used to also own an infomercial production company at one time. And I said to him, I said, okay, here's what I'd like to suggest to you. And I said, you seem to, I said, and so what's the percentage? It was roughly about like 15 to 20% of previous year. And I said, what's previous year? $398 million. Ooh, it's a big number.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So he had six offices, you know, different parts of the United States, included Palo Alto and San Francisco, New York City and Boston. And so I said, in Chicago, and then of course, but I might as well, Miami. So I said, okay, here's what I like to suggest that we do. I said, we have to train them to engage with the client in a particular way in order for them not to feel like they're violating the trust.
Right.
You know, they're not pitching the client for business when they should be servicing the client. Because it's a creative business where they had technical, you know, data exchange, and they also had creative that was involved, et cetera. And then, of course, these products. And so I said, so this is what we ought to do. And so I ended up setting up an offsite, you know, and for about 3 days, we did this offsite, and then we did training with them. And there's some work I did with them before we went to the offsite. And then we had like 43 people, 45 total. We had some other managers participated in the process. We did this, and then we went back, and so we went back to their offices, and I said, okay, so you guys can hit the ground running based on what I've shared with you. And so what happened is that they had a few clients that were out. The first client, basically, they had been talking to about 6 months, and for struggling with trying to connect with that client, and for whatever reason, they couldn't make the connection with them during that 6-month period. So they used the tools I gave them in this one meeting. They closed that client to the tune of $7 million.
Wow.
They had another client that they had been talking to for about 6 weeks, and basically could get headway. They want to look at pricing because of what was happening in the industry during the time period, brick and mortar, et cetera, again. And so they closed that client to the tune of $10 million. They had another client that they had been talking to. They're spending on average about $2.5 million a month. That was their spend for their ad spend. And of course, they were talking to them for about 11 weeks. They weren't getting back to them. The client was threatening to go to another competitor. And so finally, they had one spend that they went to, they had made with one of their competitors. And of course, they said, look, headquarters not allowing us to negotiate with them on pricing. So they took the tools I had, and they shared, and they used those tools that I gave them, and they shared it with the folks at headquarters, and they were able to convince the folks, because they were based in Europe, and so they were able to convince them to allow them to negotiate with the client. They went back to the client, and they were able to basically close the client, but not at the 2.5 million.
Wow.
They couldn't recover the 2.5, but they covered 27.5 million of that package. So basically, and this all happened within about 2 months after we had done training. So we basically recovered roughly about, close to over $46 million in potentially lost business.
That's a crazy story. And I want to encourage people to go to your site, the Devereux Group, and that will be in the show notes so that people can get the exact spelling. And also, we want to be able to have people find the book at bookboon.com. That's also in the show notes. So you have a wonderful story. I hope people reach out to you and learn more and go to your site and find these books, because you'll learn a ton about how to improve your business and get some better outcomes, like with Alex's passion about this whole subject of getting better decisions in your organization. So thank you, Alex. This has been gone by way too fast. But thank you so much. And people can learn more about you at your website and in your books. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Jan. I appreciate having the opportunity.
Oh,
with you and your audience, so.
my pleasure. Thank you.